October 15th, 2024. Margaret Chen had installed the cameras to catch her father wandering at night. Instead, she caught him burying evidence in the backyard at 2 a.m. Her best friend Sarah held the flashlight, the same Sarah who'd been Margaret's maid of honor, who'd helped raise Margaret's kids, who'd never mentioned knowing Margaret's father beyond polite hellos at family gatherings. The shovel hit something metal. Her father's hands shook as he pulled out a rusted jewelry box. Sarah whispered something that made him nod. They both looked toward Margaret's old bedroom window. Margaret watched the footage 17 times that night. Each viewing revealed another detail that shattered everything she thought she knew about the people she trusted most. The jewelry box belonged to her college boyfriend Danny, the one who disappeared 25 years ago, the one who'd broken her heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her phone to call the police. Her finger hovered over the screen for 30 seconds before she set it down. The rational part of her mind, the forensic accountant who'd spent 27 years following money trails and exposing corruption, screamed that she was witnessing evidence tampering, a crime. But the daughter in her couldn't reconcile the frail man on the security footage with the father who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd walked her down the aisle, who now forgot her name 3 days out of 7. She replayed the footage again. Frame by frame, she studied Sarah's face in the ghostly infrared glow. Her best friend's mouth moved silently, urgency written in every gesture. Margaret had seen that expression before, when Sarah talked her out of confronting her cheating ex-husband, when she'd convinced Margaret to take the job in Boston that saved her career. Sarah protecting her, always protecting her. The timestamp read, 2:17 a.m. Margaret glanced at her watch, 6:45 a.m. Her father would be awake soon, shuffling to the kitchen for his morning coffee and pills. The same routine he'd followed since her mother's funeral 6 weeks ago, one of the few constants his deteriorating memory still held. Margaret closed her laptop and crept downstairs. The hardwood floors creaked under her weight, sounds that had terrified her as a teenager sneaking back from parties. Now they felt like accusations. Through the kitchen window, she could see the disturbed earth near her mother's prized rose bushes, fresh dirt scattered across the lawn, a shovel leaning against the garden shed. Evidence of a crime committed while she slept 20 feet away. The coffee maker gurgled to life automatically. Her mother had programmed it years ago, and somehow her father still remembered to fill it each night. Margaret poured herself a cup with shaking hands, the ceramic rim chattering against her teeth. Danny Morrison. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in years. The boy who'd promised her everything during their junior year at Yale, then vanished without explanation. She'd found the note in her dorm room, "I can't do this anymore. Found someone else. Don't try to find me." For months, she'd blamed herself. Wondered what she'd done wrong, how she'd failed to keep him. Sarah had been the one to put her back together, driving up from Hartford every weekend, bringing ice cream and terrible movies and fierce loyalty. "He's a coward," Sarah had said, over and over. "You deserve better than someone who runs away instead of talking to you." But Danny hadn't run away. He'd been buried in her backyard for 25 years. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, "Coffee later? Need to talk about something important." The mug slipped from Margaret's fingers, shattering against the tile floor. Coffee splashed across the white cabinets, leaving dark stains that looked like blood. "Margaret?" Her father's voice drifted from upstairs, confused and querulous. "What was that noise?" "Just drop something, Dad. Go back to sleep." She knelt among the ceramic shards, her reflection fractured in the spilled coffee. Each piece showed a different version of herself: daughter, friend, professional truth seeker. Which one would survive what came next? Footsteps shuffled overhead. The floorboards in the hallway groaned as her father made his way to the bathroom. Soon he'd be downstairs, asking about breakfast, wondering why she looked pale. Her father, who'd been a district judge for 30 years, who'd built his reputation on integrity and careful interpretation of the law, who'd apparently buried evidence of a murder. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened Sarah's text thread. Their last conversation had been about Margaret's father's doctor appointments, Sarah offering to drive him when Margaret couldn't get away from work. Normal friend things, supportive friend things. She typed and deleted a dozen responses. What did you say to someone who'd held the flashlight while your father dug up your dead boyfriend? How did you ask your best friend if she was a murderer or an accomplice? The rational choice was obvious. Call Detective Morrison, no relation to Danny despite the name, and report what she'd witnessed. Let the police sort through the implications. Let the justice system her father had served for 3 decades determine his fate. But Margaret had learned long ago that truth was rarely clean. In her work, she'd uncovered embezzlement schemes that destroyed families, pension fraud that left retirees destitute, tax evasion that crumbled charitable foundations. The numbers always added up in the end, but the human cost was immeasurable. Her father appeared in the doorway, white hair standing at odd angles, his pajamas wrinkled from restless sleep. He looked at the broken mug, then at Margaret's face, and for a moment his eyes cleared with startling lucidity. "You know," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret stood slowly, ceramic crunching under her feet. "Dad, I need to call Sarah." "No." The word escaped Margaret's lips before she could stop it. "Dad, you can't call her. Not yet." William Chen studied his daughter's face with an intensity she hadn't seen in months. The fog that usually clouded his eyes had lifted, revealing the sharp judicial mind that had once commanded courtrooms. It was like watching a ghost materialize. Her real father, the one who existed before the dementia began stealing him piece by piece. "Sit down, sweetheart." His voice carried the same gentle authority he'd used when she was 7 and had nightmares, when she was 16 and thought the world was ending because Tommy Fletcher didn't ask her to prom. "Let me clean this up first." He moved with surprising steadiness, retrieving the broom from the pantry. Margaret watched him sweep the broken ceramic with methodical precision, the same way he'd once organized legal briefs, each motion deliberate, considered. She wanted to help but found herself frozen, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this moment of clarity. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something else, the faint scent of turned earth that clung to her father's pajamas. Evidence her mind cataloged automatically. But evidence of what, exactly? "I installed cameras," Margaret said as he disposed of the shards, "to monitor your health. I was worried about you forgetting to take your medication or falling." "I know." William rinsed the dustpan in the sink, his movements unhurried. "Found the one in the hallway last week. Clever placement, I almost missed it." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "You've known this whole time?" "I may be losing my memory, but I haven't lost my eyesight. Not yet." He turned to face her, and Margaret saw something she'd never noticed before, how much weight he'd lost since her mother's funeral. His pajama top hung loose on his frame, and his wedding ring spun freely on his finger. "Your mother always said you got your attention to detail from me." Margaret's throat tightened at the mention of her mother. Helen Chen had been the steady constant in their family, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversary dates, who kept the household running while William presided over cases. She'd also been the one person who could calm Margaret's anxious mind during childhood thunderstorms. "I miss her too," William said, reading her expression. He poured himself coffee with hands that barely trembled. "Every morning I wake up and forget she's gone. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again." The raw honesty in his voice made Margaret's chest ache. This was why she'd moved back to Millfield, not just to monitor his physical decline, but to preserve these fragments of connection before they disappeared entirely. She'd given up her corner office in Boston, her pristine condo overlooking the harbor, her carefully constructed life of professional achievement and emotional distance. Because underneath her success, her reputation as a woman who could follow money trails through the most Byzantine schemes, Margaret was still the girl who'd crawled into her parents' bed during storms. Still the daughter who called her mother every Sunday, who drove 3 hours for family dinners she complained about but secretly cherished. "Tell me about Danny," she whispered. William's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, the lucidity in his eyes flickered, and for a moment Margaret thought she'd lost him to the fog again. Then he set the cup down with exaggerated care. "What do you remember about that time? Your junior year?" "I remember he left, said he'd found someone else." The words tasted bitter, even after all these years. "I remember feeling like I wasn't enough, like I'd failed somehow." "You were never the failure, Margaret." The firmness in his voice startled her. "Never." Outside, a cardinal landed on the windowsill, its red breast bright against the gray morning. Margaret's mother had loved cardinals, claimed they were messengers from heaven. The bird cocked its head, studying them through the glass with one dark eye before flying away. "Sarah's been protecting me from something," Margaret said slowly, pieces clicking together like numbers in a ledger. "All these years. That's what this is about, isn't it?" William's silence was answer enough. What did he do to me, Dad? What happened that I don't remember? Some truths are heavier than others. William's voice cracked with exhaustion. Some secrets are carried so others don't have to. Margaret thought about the security footage, Sarah's urgent gestures, the careful way her father and best friend had worked together in the darkness. Two people who loved her, who'd apparently spent 25 years protecting her from knowledge that could destroy her. But Margaret had built her career on uncovering inconvenient truths. She'd never walked away from evidence, no matter how damaging or complicated. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who'd exposed countless lies was surrounded by the biggest deception of her life. I need to understand, she said. William reached for his phone, his movements heavy with resignation and something else, relief perhaps at finally being caught. Then we call Sarah, he said, and God help us all. William's thumb hovered over Sarah's contact information for a long moment before pressing call. Margaret watched the phone ring once, twice, then Sarah's voice filled the kitchen, breathless and sharp with anxiety. William, is everything okay? It's barely 7 in the morning. Margaret's father looked at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded, though her stomach churned with dread. There would be no going back after this conversation, no returning to the comfortable lies that had shaped her understanding of her own life. Sarah, I need you to come over. Margaret knows about last night. The silence stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Then Sarah's voice returned, smaller now, defeated. She saw the cameras. She saw everything. Another pause. Margaret could hear Sarah's breathing, quick and shallow. In the background, the sound of a car door slamming, an engine starting. Already on her way, Margaret realized. Sarah had been waiting for this call. I'll be there in 15 minutes, Sarah said. Don't say anything else until I get there, please. The line went dead. William set his phone on the counter with trembling fingers, and Margaret saw her father fully again. Not the sharp judge who'd commanded respect, but an old man carrying a burden too heavy for his failing shoulders. She's been expecting this day, Margaret said. We both have, for 25 years. William slumped into his chair at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd helped Margaret with calculus, homework, where they'd argued about her choice to study accounting instead of law, where he'd given his blessing for her marriage to David, a union that had lasted exactly 4 years and 3 months. Margaret remained standing, energy crackling through her limbs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to pack her things and drive back to Boston, to let sleeping secrets lie. But her feet stayed planted on the coffee-stained tiles, held by invisible chains of love and loyalty and professional curiosity. The next 14 minutes passed in oppressive silence. William stared into his coffee cup as if it might offer absolution. Margaret found herself cataloging details with forensic precision, the way morning light slanted through the window where her mother's plant still sat dying on the sill, the tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time in this house for 40 years, the faint smell of earth that seemed to permeate everything now. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway with a crunch of gravel that sounded like breaking bones. Through the window, Margaret watched her best friend sit motionless behind the wheel for several seconds, gathering courage or perhaps saying goodbye to the last moments before their world shifted irrevocably. When Sarah finally walked through the back door, she'd had a key for 15 years, ever since Margaret's mother's first heart attack. She looked like a woman heading to her execution. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders. She wore yesterday's clothes, wrinkled and grass-stained. Maggie. Sarah's voice broke on the nickname only she was allowed to use. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. Find out what exactly? Margaret's words came out harder than she intended. That my best friend and my father have been meeting in secret? That you've been lying to me for decades? That Danny Morrison didn't leave me? He's been buried in Mom's garden this whole time? Sarah flinched as if struck. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Your father's been getting confused, mixing up dates. Last night he called me, said it was happening again, that we needed to move Danny before you found him. I tried to explain that you were grown up now, that it was 2024, but he was so agitated. So you helped him dig up a body? Margaret's voice rose an octave. Sarah, what the hell happened 25 years ago? Sarah's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sank into the chair across from William. He was going to rape you, Maggie. Danny, he had been drugging your drinks for weeks. That night, he brought you back to my apartment because your roommate was there. He thought I was studying at the library. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. The kitchen seemed to tilt around her. "I came home early," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Found him on top of you. You were unconscious. He was—" She broke off, shoulders shaking. "I hit him with a lamp. Just meant to stop him, but he fell wrong. Hit his head on the coffee table." Margaret's knees gave way. She grabbed the counter, fighting waves of nausea as memories she'd buried deep began to surface. Fragmented images of Danny's hands too rough, drinks that tasted wrong, waking up sick and disoriented with no memory of how she'd gotten to Sarah's apartment. "You killed him," she whispered. "I saved you," Sarah replied, meeting her eyes. "And I'd do it again." Margaret stumbled backward until her spine hit the refrigerator door, its hum vibrating through her bones. The kitchen walls seemed to press inward, the familiar space of her childhood becoming foreign and threatening. She could taste copper in her mouth, could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. "No." The word came out strangled. "No, that's not. Danny wouldn't have." "Margaret." Her father's voice cut through her denial, gentle but implacable. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes, searching for any sign of confusion, hoping this was another manifestation of his dementia. But his gaze remained clear, painfully lucid. "Your friend saved your life," William said quietly, "and I helped her disappear the evidence because no one would have believed a 20-year-old girl defending her unconscious roommate, not against Danny Morrison." The name landed differently now, weighted with implications Margaret's mind refused to process. She pressed her palms against her temples, fighting the fragments of memory that clawed at the edges of her consciousness. Danny's cologne too strong in her nose, his laugh when she said she felt dizzy, the way he'd insisted on walking her home from parties. "I need air." Margaret pushed past Sarah toward the back door, but her legs betrayed her. She collapsed into the chair at the head of the table, her mother's chair, and suddenly she was 7 years old again, small and scared, and needing someone to explain why the world had suddenly become dangerous. Sarah reached across the table, her fingers brushing Margaret's wrist. "Maggie, please." "Don't touch me." Margaret yanked her hand away, the motion so violent it sent the salt shaker skittering across the wood. 25 years, Sarah. 25 years you've let me think I was the problem, that I wasn't enough to keep him." "We thought it was kinder," Sarah whispered. "You were so broken after. You kept asking what you'd done wrong, why he'd left. Your dad thought if you believed he'd found someone else, you could move on, heal." Margaret laughed, the sound sharp and hollow. "Heal? I spent years in therapy thinking I was fundamentally unlovable. I married David because I was so desperate to prove I could make someone stay. I've never trusted my own judgment about men because I thought I'd been so wrong about Danny." The confession hung in the air like an accusation. William's face crumpled, aging another decade in the span of heartbeats. "We made the wrong choice," he said heavily, "but we made it out of love." "Love?" Margaret's voice cracked. "You made me believe I was broken. Both of you watched me blame myself for something that was never my fault." She stood abruptly, needing distance from their stricken faces. At the window, she stared out at the rose garden where Danny Morrison had been buried beneath her mother's prize-winning blooms. Helen Chen, who'd tended those flowers every spring, who'd won the garden club's annual competition 3 years running. Had she known? Had Margaret's mother spent decades nurturing beauty above a grave? "Mom knew," Margaret said, not bothering to make it a question. The silence behind her was confirmation enough. She helped plant the roses. Said they needed deep soil preparation. Sarah's voice was barely audible. She never asked questions, but she knew. Helen always knew. Another pillar of Margaret's reality crumbled. Her mother, who'd bandaged scraped knees and taught her to balance checkbooks, who'd called every Sunday to chat about weather and work and nothing important. She'd been part of the conspiracy too. How many others? Margaret turned back to face them, studying their faces with the same intensity she brought to financial fraud cases. How many people in this town know what really happened? "No one else," William said quickly. "Sarah called me that night, hysterical. I went to her apartment, saw what had happened. We couldn't risk calling the police, not with Danny's family connections, not with you in that condition. The Morrison family. Old Connecticut money, political influence stretching back generations." Margaret remembered now. Danny's father had been a state senator, his uncle a federal judge. The kind of family that could make problems disappear, that could turn a victim into the villain with a few well-placed phone calls. So you made me disappear instead, Margaret said bitterly. You drugged me. The hospital, Sarah interrupted. We took you to the hospital, said you'd had too much to drink at a party. They pumped your stomach, ran tests. The date rape drug was already clearing your system. Date rape drug. The clinical term hit Margaret like ice water, making the horror real in a way the euphemisms couldn't. Danny hadn't just been planning to rape her, he'd been methodical about it, calculated. How many times had she accepted drinks from him, trusted him, let him walk her home? Her phone buzzed against the table. A text notification lit up the screen, unknown number. Some secrets won't stay buried forever. Margaret's blood turned to ice. With shaking fingers, she showed the message to Sarah and her father. Sarah went pale, but William's expression darkened with something that looked like recognition and fear. Who else knows about this? Margaret demanded. But before either could answer, gravel crunched in the driveway again. Through the window, Margaret saw a black sedan she didn't recognize pulling up behind Sarah's car. Someone was coming. The sedan's engine ticked in the sudden silence as all three of them froze, watching the dark vehicle through the kitchen window. Margaret's mouth went dry as she realized the timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment when all the players were gathered in one place. Get away from the window, William whispered, his judicial instincts kicking in despite his frail condition. Both of you. A car door slammed with metallic finality. Margaret caught a glimpse of expensive shoes on the gravel, polished leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her forensic mind cataloged details automatically: late-model sedan with government plates, single occupant, purposeful stride toward the front door rather than the back entrance Sarah had used. Dad, who is that? Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. William's face had gone ashen, but his eyes held a terrible clarity that made Margaret's stomach clench. Someone who's been waiting 25 years for this conversation. The doorbell rang once, twice. Then came the sound that chilled Margaret to the bone, a key turning in the front door lock. Whoever this was had access to her childhood home, had been granted entry by someone in this kitchen. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floors of the front hall, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to find them. Sarah grabbed Margaret's wrist, her grip desperate. We should have told you, she whispered urgently. God, we should have told you years ago. The footsteps paused outside the kitchen door. Margaret found herself holding her breath, every muscle in her body coiled for flight. But there was nowhere to run. The back door led to the garden where Danny Morrison's remains had been disturbed just hours ago, and the front of the house was blocked by their uninvited visitor. William. The voice that came through the door was cultured, familiar in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. I know you're in there. We need to talk. Margaret's father straightened in his chair, and for a moment she glimpsed the judge he'd once been, the man who'd commanded respect in courtrooms, who'd sent criminals to prison with unwavering moral authority. That same authority now seemed fractured, compromised by decades of carrying someone else's secret. Come in, Tom, William called, resignation heavy in his voice. The kitchen door swung open to reveal a man in his 70s, silver-haired and expensively dressed despite the early hour. Margaret recognized him immediately, though he'd aged since she'd last seen him at some long-ago political fundraiser. Thomas Morrison, Danny's father, former state senator, and the man whose family's influence had shaped the cover-up of his son's death. Margaret. His eyes found hers with unsettling intensity. You've grown into quite an accomplished woman. Your mother was so proud of your forensic work. She used to send me newspaper clippings about your big cases. The casual mention of her dead mother in connection with this nightmare made Margaret's vision blur with rage. How dare you? Your mother understood the delicate nature of certain situations, Morrison interrupted smoothly. Helen was always practical about protecting the people she loved. Sarah's grip on Margaret's wrist tightened to the point of pain. Tom, you said you'd leave her alone if we kept quiet. That was the deal. The deal was that this stays buried forever. Morrison's veneer of civility cracked slightly. But someone's been asking questions in town, mentioning Danny's name, wondering why there was never a proper missing persons investigation. Margaret's mind raced. Who's been asking questions? Morrison pulled out his phone, showing them a screenshot of a Facebook post. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she read, looking for information about Danny Morrison, who disappeared from Millfield area in 1999. Family friend conducting genealogy research. Please message with any details. Posted 3 days ago by an account with no profile picture, Jennifer Morrison Walsh. My niece, Morrison said quietly. Danny's cousin. She's been researching family history for months, getting suspicious about the gaps in Danny's timeline. She drove up from New York yesterday, started asking around town about her missing cousin. The walls seemed to close in further. Margaret realized that their 25-year-old secret had always been living on borrowed time. Eventually, someone would care enough to dig deeper, to question the convenient story of Danny simply disappearing. She's staying at the Millfield Inn, Morrison continued. Plans to file a formal missing persons report this afternoon, push for the case to be reopened. DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar. She has resources and determination. Margaret looked at Sarah's stricken face, at her father's trembling hands, at Morrison's cold calculation. 3 people who'd spent decades protecting her from a truth she'd never asked to be shielded from. And now their protective lie was crumbling, threatening to destroy not just their secret, but potentially Sarah's freedom. What do you want? Margaret asked, though she already dreaded the answer. Morrison smiled, but it never reached his eyes. I want to make sure we're all telling the same story when Jennifer Morrison Walsh comes asking her questions. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Margaret stared at Morrison's cold smile, her mind racing through the implications of his words. We're all telling the same story. The phrase carried the weight of threat and conspiracy, but something about his tone felt wrong. Too confident, too knowing. What story exactly? Margaret asked, her forensic instincts kicking in despite the chaos in her head. Morrison's smile widened, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something predatory beneath his polished exterior. The same story we've been telling for 25 years, that my son left town to start fresh somewhere else, that he was troubled, unpredictable, that good families sometimes produce bad seeds. Sarah's grip on Margaret's wrist loosened, confusion flickering across her face. Tom, what are you... You think I didn't know? Morrison's laugh was sharp, cutting through the kitchen air like broken glass. You think I didn't know exactly what kind of man my son was becoming? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Margaret felt her father go rigid beside her, his breathing shallow and rapid. You knew, William whispered, and it wasn't a question. Of course I knew. Morrison's mask of civility fell away completely. Danny had been experimenting since high school. The gardener girl, the senator's daughter, that waitress from the country club. I spent years cleaning up his messes, paying for silence, making problems disappear. Margaret's vision blurred as the full scope of the horror became clear. There were others. 6 that I know of, probably more. Morrison spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. The drugs made them compliant, made their testimony unreliable. Even when they remembered enough to file reports, who was going to believe them over a Morrison? Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal. You let us think we were murderers. You let us bury your son and carry that guilt for 25 years when you knew... I knew he deserved exactly what he got. Morrison's voice turned ice cold. But I also knew that having a dead rapist for a son would destroy my political career, my family's reputation, everything I'd built. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet as pieces clicked into place. The cover-up hadn't been about protecting Sarah from prosecution. It had been about protecting Thomas Morrison from scandal. You used us, she breathed. You used our guilt, our fear, to keep us quiet about what Danny really was. I used your love for each other. Morrison's eyes glittered with satisfaction. William couldn't risk his daughter learning she'd been dating a predator. Sarah couldn't live with being a killer, even a justified one. And you, Margaret, you were so beautifully broken, so convinced it was your fault he left. Her father struggled to his feet, fury overriding his frailty. You bastard! We could have gone to the police, could have told the truth, and destroyed Sarah's life? Made Margaret relive her trauma in court? Morrison shook his head mockingly. No, you chose to protect the people you loved. I simply allowed you to continue believing that protection was necessary. Margaret's hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. Morrison had been pulling their strings for decades, using their love for each other as leverage to maintain his own family's pristine reputation. "The phone call," Margaret said suddenly, her voice deadly quiet. "You're the one who told Jennifer Morrison Walsh to start digging." Morrison's smile returned, triumphant. "My niece is very suggestible. A few carefully placed family photos, some hints about unfinished business. She was eager to play detective. "But why now?" Sarah demanded. "Why bring this up after all these years?" "Because I'm 73 years old, and I need to ensure certain secrets die with me," Morrison replied. "My niece's investigation will conclude that Danny simply chose to disappear, a troubled young man who wanted to start over. Case closed, permanently." Margaret felt something cold and sharp unfurl in her chest. "And if we don't cooperate," Morrison's expression hardened, "then Jennifer might learn some very interesting details about what really happened to her cousin. DNA evidence linking you to the scene, Sarah. Security footage from the hardware store where someone matching your father's description bought unusual gardening supplies 25 years ago, William. The threat hung in the air like poison gas." Margaret looked at the two people who had shaped her life, who had carried an unbearable burden to protect her, and saw them shrinking under Morrison's calculated cruelty. But something Morrison had said echoed in her mind, the same story we've been telling for 25 years. Not protecting Sarah from prosecution, not shielding Margaret from trauma, protecting the Morrison family name. "You know what I think?" Margaret said, her voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began. "I think you need us quiet more than we need you cooperative." Morrison's confidence flickered for just a moment, but it was enough. "I think," Margaret continued, stepping closer to the man who had orchestrated their decades of guilt, "you just made a very expensive mistake.